All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to be reading chapter 16 of Black Reconstruction, Back Towards Slavery. Inspired to read it in some ways because of the Voting Rights Act being effectively terminated recently with the Louisiana Calloy decision. Yeah. I think we need to get a better picture of our long view history, as Dr. Carr would say. Yeah, let's think about Reconstruction, the 1880s. One of the things that I was struck by in this chapter was Du Bois cites somebody talking about at that time that what was happening to the Negroes was worse than savage warfare. And savage warfare is a term that I got a bit more familiar with through the work of Dr. Myron Clay Gilmore. Savage warfare, and also Nick Estes, Dr. Nick Estes. Savage warfare is the kind of warfare that the U.S. practices basically against like Native American and like Indian kind of populations. And it's characterized by having different kinds of rules than how they would go to war against a white nation, basically. So it's more. Yeah, so it's savage warfare. They throw out a bunch of rules, but what they described is what was happening to the blacks after and during like Reconstruction, like the violence they experienced was that it was worse than savage warfare. And so yeah, Du Bois starts this by saying, "How civil war in the South began again, indeed had never ceased, and how black Prometheus, bound to the rock of ages by hate, hurt, and humiliation, has his vitals eaten out as they grow, yet lives and fights." And bear with me, it's like 2 a.m. It must be remembered and never forgotten that the Civil War in the South, which overthrew Reconstruction, was a determined effort to reduce black labor as nearly as possible to a condition of unlimited exploitation and build a new class of capitalists on this foundation. The wage of the Negro worker, despite the war amendments, was to be reduced to the level of bare subsistence by taxation, peonage, caste, and every method of discrimination. This program had to be carried out in open defiance of the clear letter of the law. The lawlessness in the South since the Civil War has varied in its phases. First, it was that kind of disregard for law which follows all war. Then it became a labor war, an attempt on the part of impoverished capitalists and landholders to force laborers to work on the capitalists' own terms. From this, it changed to a war between laborers, white and black men fighting for the same jobs. Afterward, the white laborer joined the white landholder and capitalist and beat the black laborer into subjection through secret organizations and the rise of a new doctrine of race hatred. It is always difficult to stop war, and doubly difficult to stop a civil war. Inevitably, when men have long been trained to violence and murder, the habit projects itself into civil life after peace, and there is crime and disorder and social upheaval, as we who live in the backwash of world war know too well. But in the case of civil war, where the contending parties must rest face to face after peace, there can be no quick and perfect peace. When to all this you add a servile and disadvantaged race, who represent the cause of war, and who afterwards are left nearly naked to their enemies, war may go on more secretly, more spasmodically, and yet as truly as before the peace. This was the case in the South after Lee's surrender. Emancipation loosed the finer feelings of some Southerners towards Negroes. They felt the fall of a burden and expressed it. The nightmare was at last over. They need no longer apologize to the world for a system they were powerless to change or reconstruct. It had been changed, and they were glad. But emancipation left the planters poor and with no method of earning a living, except by exploiting black labor on their only remaining capital, their land. This underlying economic urge was naturally far stronger than the philanthropic and motivated the mass of Southerners. Carl Schurz said, "Some planters held back their former slaves on their plantations by brute force. Armed bands of white men patrolled the county roads to drive back the Negroes wandering about. Dead bodies of murdered Negroes were found on and near the highways and byways. Gruesome reports came from the hospitals. Reports of colored men and women whose ears had been cut off, whose skulls had been broken by blows, whose bodies had been slashed by knives or lacerated with scourges. A number of such cases. I had occasion to examine myself. A veritable reign of terror prevailed in many parts of the South." Yeah, this chapter is going to describe a lot of violence that happens. Yeah, so creator be with me. Many testified that the Southern people seemed to have transferred their wrath at the federal government to the colored people. The disorder and utter lack of control was widespread. Governor Sharkey of Mississippi found an unprecedented amount of lawlessness in 1866. Mrs. Smeads, a Southern white woman, tells of incidents in Mississippi involving both whites and Negroes. At this time, incendiary fires were common. There were not much law in the land. We heard of the gin houses and cotton houses that were burned in all directions. One day, as Thomas came back from a business journey, the smoldering ruin of his gin house met his eyes. The building was itself valuable and necessary. All the cotton that he owned was consumed in it. He had not a dollar. He had to borrow the money to buy a postage stamp, not only during this year, but during many years to come. It was a time of deepest gloom. Thomas had been wounded to the bottom of his affectionate heart by the perfidy of the white man who had brought this on his house. In the midst of the grinding poverty that now fell in full force on him, he heard of the reckless extravagance of this man on the money that should have been used to meet these debts. Bands of Confederate soldiers roamed in some states. There have been a number of complaints made to Captain Glavis by citizens of Wayne, Greene, and Sampson counties of numerous robberies and acts of violence by a band of late rebels who are inhabitants of Wynne County. They are said to be headed by one Frank Coley. Some 8 weeks ago, several returned rebel soldiers from Pitt County went into the village of Washington and commenced shooting and beating Union men. Several assaults were made, and at least one Union man was publicly whipped in the streets, and some Negroes were wounded. One of the party was badly wounded by a person whom they attacked. On their return, they met on the public highway a Negro. They first castrated him, and afterwards murdered him in cold blood. In Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, it was said in 1866, "The life of a Negro is not worth much there." I have seen one who was shot in the leg while he was riding a mule because the ruffian thought it was more trouble to ask him to get off the mule than to shoot him. There was a very large class of such people in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. I had expected to find Texas in a much worse condition, but I found it much safer there than in Alabama and Mississippi. Particularly in Alabama, the people have been rendered desperate. The crops for the past year have been very poor. The rust and the army worm have destroyed their cotton crops, and there is much want and suffering among the people. An argument frequently employed in justifying the outrages on the freedmen is that the whites were goaded into it by the evils of Negro domination. The argument holds good in part, but only in part, for unhappily the outrages were committed before the suffrage was conferred upon the blacks, before such a step was even favored by any considerable number of Northern people. Clara Barton, who visited Andersonville, Georgia in 1866, tells the story of a colored wife of 18 whom her husband, a blacksmith, brought to her, walking 30 or 40 miles. I took his wife into my tent and examined her back. She was a young, bright-colored woman, a little darker than he, with a fair, patient face, with nothing sulky in her look. I found across her back 12 lashes or gashes, partly healed and partly not, some of them cut into the bone. She must have been whipped with a lash half as large as my little finger. It may have been larger. And one of these lashes was from 8 to 10 inches in length, and the flesh had been cut completely out most of the way. It had been a curling whip. It had curled around her arms, cut inside the arm, over the back, and the same on the other side. There were 12 of those long lashes, partly healed and partly not. She could not bear her clothing on her at that time, except thrown loosely over her shoulders. She had got strong enough so as to be able to walk, but she was feeble and must have been unable to work before that occurred. She was in no condition to work. She had been, quote, bucked and gagged by her employer, thrown on her face and lashed on her back so that when her husband found her, he said she was, quote, a gore of blood. The offense was that in the last couple months of pregnancy, she had proved unable to do the task of spinning which was given her. There was in those southern states which I have visited for some years after the war and up to the year 1868, or in some cases 1870, much disorder, and a condition of lawlessness toward the blacks, a disposition greatest in the more distant and obscure regions, to trample them underfoot, to deny them equal rights, and to injure or kill them on slight or no provocations. The tremendous change in the social arrangements of the Southern whites had suffered a defeat which was sore to bear, and on top of this, they saw their slaves, their most valuable and cherished property, taken away and made free, and not only free, but their political equals. One needs to go into the far South to know what this really meant, and what deep resentment and irritation it inevitably bred. The unrest and bitterness of post-war lawlessness were gradually transmuted into economic pressure. Systematic efforts were made by the owners to put the Negro to work, an equally determined effort by which the poor whites to keep him from work, which competed with them or threatened their future work and income. Cotton and other crops were high in price, and hard work would soon restore something of the losses of war. The planters offered the ex-slave, therefore, a labor contract, and were surprised when he refused. He had to refuse. The plantation laborer, under the conditions offered, would still be a slave, with small chance to rise to the position of independent farmer or even a free modern laborer. On the other hand, the poor whites were determined to keep the blacks from access to the richer and better land from which slavery had driven the white peasants. A three-cornered battle ensued, and increased lawlessness aggression. Recurrent crop failures due to the weather made more trouble, and at the same time the wars of Europe, the 7 Weeks' War, and the Franco-Prussian War disturbed civilization. In such an economic revolution, the cost of change and uplift ought to fall on the community, the nation, and the government. The plantation land should have gone to those who worked it, and the former owners should have been compensated in some part for a lost investment made with the social sanction of the nation. To this should have been added economic opportunity and access to the land for the poor whites. But such a possible outcome was frustrated by the economic selfishness of the North and by the intransigent attitude of the vast majority of the planters. They did not believe in freedom for Negroes, and they sought to frustrate it by law, force, and deliberate cheating, and by arrogant demands for economic license and political power, such as no sane nation could grant. This result was federal Reconstruction, a lawlessness which in 1865 to 1868 was still spasmodic and episodic, now became organized, and its real underlying industrial causes obscured by political excuses and race hatred. Using a technique of mass and midnight murder, the South began widely organized aggression upon the Negroes. When Congress intervened by its Reconstruction measures to defeat the reactionary program of the South, there swept over that section a crime storm of devastating fury. Lawlessness and violence filled the land, and terror stalked abroad by day, and it burned and murdered by night. The southern states had actually relapsed into barbarism. During that period, a new generation was conceived and born to the South of both races that was literally conceived in lawlessness and born into crime-producing conditions. Lawlessness was its inheritance, and the red splotch of violence its birthmark. Armed guerrilla warfare killed thousands of Negroes. Political riots were staged. Their causes or occasions were always obscure, their results always certain. 10 to 100 times as many Negroes were killed as whites. Then differences began to arise. Instead of driving the Negroes to work, bands of poor whites began to drive them from work. Private vengeance was taken upon prosperous and hard-working Negroes. A number of Negroes were employed in building the airline railroad between Atlanta and Charlotte. Disguised men went there, took the Negroes and whipped them, forced them back to the farms to work. They were receiving money wages for working on the railroad. A man from Ohio living in Clarendon County, South Carolina, had his stock in business amounting to $40,000 a year entirely destroyed. $40,000 a year in 1860. That's a lot of money. There was a good many industrious men who, if they could get a start, would make crops of their own and become independent farmers. In every such case, where colored men could bring proper recommendations there of evidences of industry, he would take advances to them as well as to white men. The farmers about complained that in this way he was taking away laborers and making Negroes independent farmers. They whipped him, ruined his business, and drove him out of the state. In Choctaw County, Alabama, a colored man, Robert Fullerlove, lived. Masked men shot into his house and burned it. He and his neighbors were killed and driven away. I have 400 acres of land. I have about 20 head of cattle, little and big. I have an ox team, and in the lot of cattle there are 7 milk cows. I have corn and fodder and hogs. I had a very fine crop of cotton planted and was going over it when this last raid happened at my house. I have lost my crop entirely, and it isn't worthwhile for me to say. I am a hard-working man, and I love what I have worked for and earned. Augustus Blair of Huntsville, Alabama, was a hard-working old black man who had stayed at home during the war and helped to take care of the little white children. The Ku Klux came to his house, seized his son, and beat and maltreated him. He got so he could get about a little. He got so he could get about a little. I hired a wagon and fetched him there, but directly he came here, he was taken down with a hemorrhage that came from stamping him on the stomach and breast. They stamped him all over the stomach and breast. In 2 weeks after he was examined in the courtroom there, he died. Everybody that saw him said he couldn't live, and they were surprised that he lived so long. I had the doctors to tend to him. I owe $40 or $50 to Dr. Henry Benford. He asked me for the money on Saturday after all this was done. I knew every man of them, and I came here and made complaint. Mr. Wager assisted me, and Jim Common of Athens told me to have them arrested before the grand jury. I had a good deal of property down there. I had 30 head of hogs and 4 bales of cotton. I had 4 bales ginned and fetched my wife and young child there. I didn't want to go away. I hadn't done anything, but I believed they would have treated me just the same way, and I went away. I left 30 head of hogs and 1 good milk cow, 4 bales of cotton, and my corn in the field. Jim Common told me to sue for it. I went down there and all my things were gone. These happenings were not confined to particular regions. They spread all over the South. In 1866, the first church for colored people was opened by the American Mission Association at Memphis, Tennessee. It was burned with all the colored churches in Memphis in the riot that year. In the 18 months ending June 30th, 1867, General Canby reported 197 murders and 548 cases of aggravated assault in North and South Carolina. In reference to South Carolina, the report of the Joint Select Committee of the two Houses of Congress of 1872 contains such a mass of revolting details that one cannot decide where to begin their citation or where to stop. Murders or attempts to murder are numerous. Whippings are without number. Probably the most cruel and cowardly of these last was the whipping of Elias Hill. He was a colored man who had from infancy been dwarfed in legs and arms. He was unable to use either, but he possessed an intelligent mind, had learned to read, and had acquired an unusual amount of knowledge for one in his circumstance. He was a Baptist preacher. He was highly respected for his upright character. He was eminently religious and was greatly revered by the people of his own race. It was on this ground that he was visited by the Ku Klux, brutally beaten and dragged from his house into the yard, where he was left in the cold at night, unable to walk or crawl. Savage warfare. A report from South Carolina tells of 97 Negroes killed and 146 shot and whipped. There are riots because of the arming of Negroes. White farmers who are displaced as tenants attack the Negro tenants. Negro churches are burned. In one community, 4/5 of the Negro men are sleeping out in the woods. Gins and gin houses are burned in retaliation by Negroes. Colored women are whipped and raped by whites. In some cases, the white landholders try to protect Negroes, while the irresponsible poor whites lead the attack. Class collaboration. In some cases, the white landholders try to protect Negroes, while the irresponsible poor whites lead the attack. In another community, 11 murders and more than 600 whippings have gone unnoticed. While there are 7 cases of incendiary burnings, Negro artisans are stopped from following their trade, and the antagonism between poor whites and Negroes grows. 6 Negro foundrymen were beaten and blacksmiths whipped. In Edgefield and Lawrence counties, South Carolina, there were organized bands of regulators, armed men who make it their business to traverse these counties and maltreat Negroes without any avowed definite purpose in view. The regulators treat the Negroes in many instances in the most horrible and atrocious manner, even to maiming them, cutting their ears off, etc. In one case, 2 citizens of one of these counties testified against these parties and were instantly compelled to leave the county, barely escaping with their lives. The citizens are bound in honor by an understanding or compact among them not to testify against these regulators, so that it is impossible to get evidence against them unless the Negro gives it. The report of the Ku Klux investigation published in 1871 said of South Carolina that in the 9 counties covered by the investigation for a period of approximately 6 months, the Ku Klux Klan lynched and murdered 35 men, whipped 262 men and women, otherwise outraged, shot, mutilated, burned out, etc., 101 persons. It committed 2 cases of sex offense against Negro women. During this time, the Negroes killed 4 men, beat 1 man, committed 16 other outrages, but no case of torture. No case is found of a white woman seduced or raped by a Negro. The reasons given for the Ku Klux outrages were significantly varied. The victim should suffer in revenge for killing, and for some cases for arson. They were Republicans. They were radical. They had attempted to hold elections. They were carrying arms. They were niggers. They were damn niggers. They boasted that they would own land. They should be made to recant Republican principles, and they should give desired information. In Georgia, in 1868, disturbances are reported in the northwest section where the poor whites are in the majority. Negroes were whipped for debt, for associating with white women, and for trying to vote. In the Cotton Belt, where the Negroes outnumbered the whites, 3 white members of the legislature were killed, and there were insurrections and riots culminating in the one at Camilla. In this case, 300 Republicans, mostly Negroes, with music and banner, were marching to hold a public meeting. They were met by the sheriff and told that they could not meet. A riot ensued, where 8 or 9 Negroes were killed and 20 to 40 wounded. No whites were killed. The Negro Secretary of State, Jonathan Gibbs in Florida, when called before a committee of Congress in 1871, reported 153 murders in Jackson County in that state. Conditions in Texas were particularly bad. In 1869, in 30 counties, there was no civil government, and in others, very imperfect organizations. During Sheridan's command of the state, there were 9 murders a month. If he owned both hell and Texas, Sheridan said upon one occasion he would rent out Texas and live in hell, a statement which was repeated over the country for a generation. Benjamin F. Wade added to this that he was told by a native, all that Texas needs to make it a paradise is water and good society. Yes, he answered, that's all they need in hell. A committee of the Constitution Convention of 1868 on partial returns said that 1,035 men had been murdered in Texas since the close of the war, and a federal attorney said that the number might have been 2,000. The Secretary of State reports to the Texas Senate that 905 homicides had taken place in the 2 years ending in 1870, and he believed that if all the facts were known, the total would be 1,500. In 1870, after the new state government was organized, it was officially reported that 2,970 persons charged with murder were evading arrest in the state, and 2 to 7 murders were often attributed to the same individual. From war, turmoil, poverty, forced labor, and economic rivalry of labor groups, there came again in the South the domination of the secret order, which systematized the effort to subordinate the Negro. The domination of the secret order, which systematized the effort to subordinate the Negro. The method of force, which hides itself in secrecy, is a method as old as humanity. The kind of thing that men are afraid or ashamed to do openly and by day, they accomplish secretly, masked, and at night. The method has certain advantages. It uses fear to cast out fear. It dares things at which open method hesitates. It may, with certain impunity, attack the high and the low. It need hesitate at no outrage of maiming or murder. It shields itself in the mob mind and then throws over all a veil of darkness which becomes glamour. It attracts people who otherwise could not be reached. It harnesses the mob. How is it then that men who want certain things done by brute force can so often depend upon the mob? Total depravity, human hate, and Schadenfreude do not explain fully the mob spirit in America. Before the wide eyes of the mob is ever the shape of fear. Back of the writhing, yelling, cruel-eyed demons who break, destroy, maim, and lynch and burn at the stake is a knot, large or small, of normal human beings, and these human beings at heart are desperately afraid of something. Of what? Of many things, but usually of losing their jobs, being declassed, degraded, or actually disgraced, of losing their hopes, their savings, their plans for their children, of the actual pangs of hunger, of dirt, of crime, and of all this, most ubiquitous in modern industrial society is that fear of unemployment. It is its nucleus of ordinary men that continually gives the mob its initial and awful impetus. Around this nucleus, to be sure, gather snowball-wise all manner of flotsam, filth, and human garbage, and every lewdness of alcohol and current fashion. But all this is the horrible covering of this inner nucleus of fear. How then is the mob to be met and quelled? If it represents public opinion, even passing, passionate public opinion, it cannot permanently be put down by a police which public opinion appoints and pays. 3 methods of quelling the mob are at hand. The first, by proving to its human honest nucleus that the fear is false, ill-grounded, unnecessary. Or secondly, if its fear is true, or apparently or partially true, by attacking the fearful thing openly, either by the organized police power or by frank civil war, as did Mussolini and George Washington. Or thirdly, by secret, hidden, and underground ways, the method of the Ku Klux Klan. Why do we not take the first way? Because this is a world that believes in war and ignorance, and has no hope in our day of realizing an intelligent majority of men and peace on earth. There are many, many exceptions, but in general it is true that there is scarcely a bishop in Christendom, a priest in the church, a president, governor, mayor, or legislator in the United States, a college professor, or a public school teacher who does not in the end stand by war and ignorance as the main method for the settlement of our pressing human problems. And this despite the fact that they may deny it with their mouths every day. But here again, open civil war is difficult, costly, and hard to guide. The right toward which it aims must be made obvious, even if it is wrong. In 1918, in order to win the war, we had to make Germans into Huns. In order to win, the South had to make Negroes into thieves, monsters, and idiots. Tomorrow, we must make Latins, Southeastern Europeans, Turks, and other Asiatics into actual lesser breeds without the law. Some seem to see today Antichrist in Catholicism and in Jews, international plotters of the protocol, and in the rising tide of color, a threat to all civilization and human culture. Even if these things are true, it would be difficult to bring the truth clearly before the ignorant mob and guide it toward the overthrow of evil. But if these be half true or wholly false, the mob can only be stirred to action by wholesale lying. And this is difficult and costly, and may be successfully answered, or by secret underground whispering, the method of night and mask, the psychology of vague and unknown ill, the innuendo that cannot be answered, for it is not openly published. Secret organization has long been a method of fastening dictatorship under the South. It was seen in Louisiana early in the 19th century and helped in the annexation of Texas. It was widespread in Kansas. Senator Douglas called the whole secession movement the result of an enormous conspiracy. Charles Sumner said, "Not in all history, ancient and modern, is there any record of conspiracy so vast, so wicked, ranging over such spaces, both in time and history." The evidence taken by the Congressional Committee which visited Kansas in 1858 furnished the most incontestable proof of the power and extent of those oath-bound orders. The different lodges were connected together by an effective organization. It embraced great numbers of the citizens of Missouri, and was extended into other slave states and into the territory. Its avowed purpose was not only to extend slavery into Kansas, but also into other territories of the United States. This dangerous society was controlled by men who avowed their purpose to extend slavery at all hazards. And thinking about Kansas as well, if you ever heard of the Exodusters, when Kansas opened as a slave, like as a state, opening as a free state, a lot of black people moved there. Those are called Exodusters. So for it to get then threatened to get changed into a slave state, like imagine going there because you thought you'd be free, and then oh, they about to change the free state to a slave state. It's just everywhere, all the time. You can't really go anywhere to be free. I know now that Kansas is like technically the Midwest, but people, it's like the North. Everybody's got North syndrome. Thinks that, oh, at least because we're not the South, we're better off as black people. Like Gerald Horne, he came to Minnesota a couple months ago, and he's speaking at Macalester College, and he's citing some Minnesota scholar, and he names him. I forget the name, but he says that like Minnesota is the worst state in the United States for black people across a range of statistics. But you find non-black people here, and they're like, "Oh, it's so great, it's so great here," and it's just like it reminds me of like Madison, Wisconsin, Tale of Two Cities. The renewed use of the secret orders to fasten the dictatorship of property over labor upon the South began in New Orleans in 1865, with the rebel armies were disbanded and began to return to the city. First apparently appeared the Southern Cross, determined to drive out the new Northern capitalists and reduce the Negroes to slavery. Governor Wells said in 1866, should the secret associations now organizing rapidly be able to regain the ascendancy which made it, New Orleans, a living hell for years before the rebellion, I shudder at the consequence. Meantime, a larger and more inclusive secret order had been started in Tennessee, known as the Ku Klux Klan. Tennessee, Alabama, Texas, Arkansas, and North Carolina soon fell under its action by the same methods. The new technique of the plan solidified the various objects and efforts and provided a new unity through emphasizing the importance of race. The race element was emphasized in order that property holders could get the support of the majority of white laborers and make it more possible to exploit Negro labor. Again, the race element was emphasized in order that property holders could get the support of the majority of white laborers and make it more possible to exploit Negro labor. But the race philosophy came as a new and terrible thing to make labor unity or labor class consciousness impossible. So long as the Southern white laborers could be induced to prefer poverty to equality with the Negro, just so long was a labor movement in the South made impossible. Some excuse the rise of the Ku Klux and the White League and the Knights of the White Camellia in the South with the plea that they were the answers to Negro suffrage, and that the Union League started among Negroes for the cause of secret orders among whites. There is no historic foundation for this. The Union League in the North was the movement of Northern white aristocracy, including most of the rich and well-to-do, against defeatism and the menace of the Copperhead. Its powerful and influential social clubs in New York, Philadelphia, and elsewhere exist to this day. This Union League movement influenced the labor vote in the North. It came to the South with the carpetbaggers and used the Northern technique. It employed among Negroes some ceremonies and secrecy, but it never contemplated murder and force. By no stretch of imagination could it be called an organization similar to or provocative of the Ku Klux Klan. The carpetbaggers organized the Negro voters and offered them more in wages and privileges than the whites. The logical answer of the planters in a free industrial democracy would have been to meet these offers by better ones. They chose instead force and secret revolution. It was not then the organization of Union Leagues that caused the Ku Klux Klan. It was the determination to deprive the Negroes by force of any real weapon for economic bargaining. The use of the ballot from 1868 to 1872 aroused the property holders to a frenzy of protest, but it also attracted certain elements of white labor and bade fair with reform and efficiency to build a Southern Labor Party. There was but one way to break up this threatened coalition, and that was to unite poor and rich whites by the shibboleth of race and despite divergent economic interests. The work of secret orders in 1868-1872 frustrated any mass movement toward union of white and black labor. Before 1874, the turmoil of Louisiana blazed the way. The New Orleans riot in 1866, which stirred the nation and influenced a presidential election, was due primarily to the fact that the head of a secret order was also chief of police. The Knights of the White Camellia came into prominence after Negro enfranchisement and were especially aimed at excluding Negroes from voting by terrorism and killing the leaders. The presidential election of 1868 spurred the planters and their allies to deliberate activity. They saw a chance to nullify the vote of black labor, unite with Northern Copperhead democracy, and capture the government. Frank Blair egged them on to revolution. The testimony shows that over 2,000 persons were killed, wounded, and otherwise injured in Louisiana within a few weeks prior to the presidential election in November 1868, that half the state was overrun by violence, and that midnight raids, secret murders, and open riots kept the people in constant terror until the Republicans surrendered all claim. But the most remarkable case is that of St. Landry, a planting parish on the river Teche, where the Republicans had a registered majority of 1,071 votes. In the spring of 1868, they carried the parish by 678. In the fall, they gave Grant no vote, not one, while the Democrats cast 4,787, the full vote of the parish for Seymour and Blair. Here occurred one of the bloodiest riots on record, in which the Ku Klux killed and wounded over 200 Republicans, hunting and chasing them for 2 days and nights through fields and swamps. 13 captives were taken from the jail and shot. A pail of 25 dead bodies were found half buried in the woods. Having conquered the Republicans and killed and driven off the white leaders, the Ku Klux captured the masses and marked them with badges of red flannel, enrolled them in clubs, made them vote the Democratic ticket, and gave them a certificate of the fact. In the parish of St. Bernard, a Negro was killed. A black mob killed a white man. 3 steamboats filled with armed ruffians left New Orleans for the scene of the riot. Before the trouble could be composed, a dozen or 15 men were slain. Frightful conditions prevailed up the Red River around Shreveport, in Caddo and Bossier parishes, a trading center for Texas, Arkansas, and the Indian nations. A United States Army officer on duty in this place saw 2 or 3 men shot down in the street in front of a store in which he sat. He picked up the bodies of 8 men who had been killed in one night. Never had he heard of anyone being punished for murder in that country. In that country. 120 corpses were found in the woods or were taken out of Red River after a Negro hunt in Bossier Parish. For 10 days prior to the election of November, the streets were filled with men carrying shotguns, rifles, pistols, and knives. A band of Sicilian cutthroats called the Innocents, made up largely of fruit dealers, fishermen, oystermen, and other elements drawn from the markets, roamed the city hunting Negroes. Soon no one could be found in the streets. Then the ruffians entered the houses to drive out the blacks, shooting them like rabbits as they ran. A colored man feared to sleep 2 nights in the same place. This bloody club had 2,000 members. There were more than 70 other clubs in New Orleans, bearing such names as the Seymour Southrons, the Seymour Infatadas, the Seymour Tigers, the Blair Knights, the Swamp Fox Rangers, the Hancock Club, and the Rousseau Guards. Their appearance in parades led to riots in which many were killed and injured. Disorder extended to other parts of Louisiana. In 1 month, said General Hatch of the Freedmen's Bureau, 297 persons were slain in the parishes adjacent to New Orleans. During election time, the gun stores of New Orleans were thronged with buyers, and the price of Colt's revolvers doubled. The local paper said, "Thad Stevens is dead. The prayers of the righteous have at last removed the congressional curse. May old Brownlow, Butler, and all such political monsters follow the example of their illustrious predecessor." The coup d'etat failed, and the Reconstruction government was established. But although conditions during the next 2 years showed improvement, General Maurer, in command in New Orleans, said in 1869 that the country around Winnsboro and Franklin Parish was infested by a gang of desperados and thieves who totally defied civil authorities. All this was a challenge to the North and to democratic government. The response was only half-hearted. The North recoiled from force, and force alone could dislodge the planters and allied capitalists and firmly fasten labor government on the South. The North hesitated. Did it want labor government in the South? Should black rule white even if it could? To enforce the 15th Amendment, a federal law was passed May 31st, 1870, after a long debate. There was an all-night session in the Senate May 21st, conferences between the two houses, and finally, the bill became a law May 31st. The law made minute provisions to protect by federal action all citizens in the civil and political rights guaranteed by the Constitution. It enumerated 26 misdemeanors and 5 felonies and 87 crimes. The punishments varied from $500 fine and 1 year's imprisonment to $5,000 fine and 10-year imprisonment. It was the intention of this law to protect the Negro in using his right to vote, and this protection was to be carried out through federal officials. It was known that the Southern whites were keeping the Negro from voting by methods which local officials It was known that the Southern whites were keeping the Negro from voting, which local officials and state courts could not touch. Witnesses were afraid to testify, and juries did not return verdicts, even on clear evidence. Registration was hidden. I'm going to find a place to stop soon. All right. One more page. The laws brought the whole power of the government, militia, land, and naval forces, and courts to bear upon persons who, by bribery or threat, sought to influence the Negro voter or to deprive him of his political rights. Meantime, the Ku Klux Klan, organized in Tennessee in 1865, became so widespread that in 1871, Congress appointed a joint committee to investigate it. This committee investigated conditions from April 1871 to February 19, 1872, and issued a voluminous report in 12 volumes, covering most of the southern states. This formed a tremendous and invaluable picture of the situation in the South at that time. A federal election law was passed the 28th of February 1871, which provided for a national registration of voters, a necessary and inevitable step to rescue national democracy from local particularism and possible fraud. Such a law is still needed and still lacking. President Grant was appealed to in March 1871 for military aid to suppress violence in South Carolina. He recommended legislation, and as a result, the Ku Klux Klan Enforcement Law of April 20, 1871 was passed. It strengthened the Act of 1870 and was designed to destroy conspiracies against the 14th or 15th Amendment. It empowered the president to suspend the writ of habeas corpus when, in his judgment, the public safety shall require it. The president, by proclamation of May 30th, 1871, called the attention of the nation to this act and said that it may have been necessary by persistent violations of the rights of citizens in the U.S. He recognized the responsibility placed on him and did not wish to use these extraordinary powers, but it was his duty to make it known that when it was necessary, he would use them. As a matter of fact, he only once suspended the writ of habeas corpus, in the case of certain lawless counties in South Carolina. The actual military forces at his disposal at this time were limited, amounted to only about 9,000 troops, or 1/3 of the army in the whole South. To emphasize his wish to be fair to the South, Grant urged the removal of all political disabilities of former Confederates in December 1871. A bill for this purpose had passed the House, but failed in the Senate, because Sumner tried to couple with it his Civil Rights Bill. Political disabilities of former Confederates. That's something that's interesting. Just the notion of having political disabilities. Love it. A bill for this purpose had passed the House but failed, and the Northern Democrats voted against it. It finally passed Congress in May 1872 with the civil rights feature omitted. Also in 1872, the Ku Klux Klan law expired by limitation and was not extended. Yeah, the Ku Klux Klan enforcement law that aimed to destroy conspiracies against the 14th or 15th Amendment. Meantime, in Tennessee, North Carolina, and Texas, the writ of habeas corpus had been suspended in the summer of 1870 by the governors, and in 1871, United States courts were filled with Ku Klux cases. In Mississippi, 640 persons were indicted under these enforcement laws, and 200 arrested, but not a single one convicted. President Grant declared that in some of the counties of South Carolina, 2/3 of the whites were organized and armed. In all, during 1870-1897, 5,171 cases were tried in the South and 2,200 in the North. Of these, 5,046 were dismissed, 1,432 convicted, 903 acquitted. The testimony was overwhelming, but conviction was impossible in the South. With 1872, new forms of violence took the place of old intimidation and threats and fraud. There were judicial discrimination, force, and actual civil war. Federal officials were kept busy, and the president tried in vain to execute the Force Acts. The election of 1872 and the Panic of 1873 changed the face of affairs. The labor governments built on Negro votes had kept Grant in office, since the only alternative offered the Negroes was to vote for their own disenfranchisement. The Northern Reform movement had begun to unite itself with big business and superfinance, and to sympathize with the Southern planters. The election of 1872 and the Panic of 1873 changed the face of affairs. The labor government built on Negro votes had kept Grant in office, since the only alternative offered the Negroes was to vote for their own disenfranchisement. The Northern Reform movement had begun to unite itself with the big business and superfinance, and to sympathize with the Southern planters. The planters had won this sympathy by denouncing the carpetbaggers as the cause of Southern corruption, and thus compelling these representatives of Northern capital either to unite with the planters or leave the South. The labor vote was divided along the color line, and the freedmen submerged beneath a wave of race prejudice and economic rivalry. The time was now ripe for open war on the labor of the Black Belt. Seven states had been, quote, redeemed from labor domination under the leadership of carpetbaggers and scalawags, i.e. Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Tennessee. This had been accomplished by unifying the white majority and suppressing the Negro vote by intimidation or economic pressure. It was now planned to move on the stages where the Negro majority was such that only force could dislodge them. 4 states in 1874 remained under Reconstruction governments: Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Florida. It is said that consultations among white leaders took place throughout the South, and that in May 1874, 40 men assembled on Magazine Street, New Orleans, to arrange for the final drive. They represented all of the secret organizations. They consulted during May and June, and in July, the White League was organized, under 5 comparatively unknown leaders, who were the chosen agents for the secret combinations. In less than 60 days after the formation of the New Orleans Central of the White League, it spread to the furthest parts of the state. Had before the end of the war, I'm sorry, had before the end of the year 40,000 members and was extending in all directions through the South. In Mississippi, the White League began organized work in 1874. 7 organized armed groups were formed in Vicksburg to control the city election. The charge here was extravagance in building schoolhouses and too many niggers in office. Armed companies patrolled the city, and yet there was perfect order at the polls. Voters were thus intimidated and kept at home, while in the surrounding counties, some 200 Negroes were killed. At Clinton in 1875, another blow was struck when a mass meeting and barbecue was being held by the colored men. 500 armed white men assembled. Food and wagons were destroyed, mules and horses stolen, hundreds of Negro homes searched, and fugitives driven away. Grant wrote in the Senate January 13, 1875, regarding the condition of Louisiana, the President Grant. On the 13th of April, a butchery of citizens was committed at Colfax, which in bloodthirstiness and barbarity is hardly surpassed by any acts of savage warfare. Insuperable obstructions were thrown in the way of punishing these murders, and the so-called conservative papers of the state not only justified the massacre, but denounced as federal tyranny and despotism the attempt of United States officers to bring them to justice. Concerning Mississippi, President Grant said, as to the state election of 1875, Mississippi is governed today by officials chosen through fraud and violence, such as would scarcely be accredited to savages. In 1874, the president was asked for federal troops in Mississippi and South Carolina. The president refused to send extra troops. And that's where I'm going to call it for tonight.